Welcome everyone to today's special interview. I'm thrilled to have with us Dr. Hamilton Bean, an expert whose work bridges communications, security, and whose research explores the fascinating and sometimes controversial intersection of media, wartime strategy, and public diplomacy. Dr. Bean is the professor and chair of the Department of Communication at the University of Colorado, Denver. His research interests span everything from counterterrorism and disinformation to intelligence and public diplomacy, topics that are critical today as they were in World War II, and have earned him many awards. He's also a lifelong student of World War II in the Pacific, and it's through this lens that he's written a compelling and often overlooked chapter in the Navy's history. His book, Nimitz's Newsman, Waldo Drake and the Navy's Censored War in the Pacific, is the untold story of Lieutenant Commander Waldo Drake, the U.S. fleet's first public relations officer and Nimitz's censor. In 1941, when the fleet went to war, Drake was tasked with the monumental job of managing the flow of information to the American public while balancing the need for military secrecy. But by 1944, Drake's coveted position brought him nothing but disdain. Why did this man, a once respected maritime reporter for the Los Angeles Times, become so controversial that he was removed from his post? Today, we'll dive into the complexities of wartime censorship, Drake's unique relationship with Admiral Chester Nimitz, and the high-stakes decisions that shaped American public opinion during World War II. Stay tuned. So, Dr. Bean, Hamilton, right? Going forward.
Yes.
Can you introduce the audience to Waldo Drake, why he's important, and tell us how this book came to be? There's a family connection, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Jack. I really appreciate the chance to talk to you about Waldo Drake today and share a little bit about his story. And we should acknowledge from the outset, though, that most people have never heard of Waldo Drake. He served as the first public relations officer, or PRO, for the U.S. Pacific Fleet in World War II. And as the title of the book says, he was Nimitz's newsman. And Drake was, in fact, a newsman. He had been working as a maritime reporter and editor for the Los Angeles Times for 19 years before he ever became the fleet's PRO. So Drake was close to Admiral Nimitz. The two of them played tennis together nearly every day in Pearl Harbor. And Admiral Nimitz really relied on Drake to handle the press. And by most accounts, he seemed to have done a job that was satisfactory for Admiral Nimitz. But Drake's important because as the fleet PRO, he served as basically a facilitator and a gatekeeper for news and information about the war in the Pacific that was reaching the American mainland. And he was both an advocate for correspondence, but he was also, for much of the time, the fleet's censor. And so these dual roles of public relations, public relations facilitator, but also impeding the flow of news and publicity as a censor, these dual roles created conflict and some controversy. And Drake did have a kind of menacing reputation among correspondents in Pearl Harbor, many of whom were barely half his age. So you can get a sense of Drake's character and his demeanor from a sketch that was given to Drake as a thank you gift by the noted American illustrator McClellan Barclay. This sketch, which is on the cover of the book, it was given to Drake sometime before Barclay was reported missing in action in July 1943, when the transport ship that he was aboard was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine somewhere in the Solomon Islands. But I think if you study that image of Drake, you can get a sense for this kind of stern, maybe even intimidating character, but also someone who was very professional and took his job seriously, and for the most part did a fine job. I actually donated this sketch, which, as I mentioned, is the cover of the book. I donated this sketch recently to the National Museum of the Pacific War on behalf of Drake's grandchildren. And I was hoping that maybe future generations might discover it and decide they want to learn a little bit more about Waldo Drake too. But the reason he's important is if we want to fully understand news coverage of the Pacific War, as well as the origins of today's Navy public affairs, then we really have to know something about Drake's interactions with Admiral Nimitz and other Navy officials leading up to and during the war. And yes, there is a family connection. At one point in my life, Drake was technically my step-grandfather. That is, his daughter, Errol, married my father, Reynold, in the mid-1990s. And I've included here a photograph of Drake's family on the beach in Oahu. I think it's either summer or fall of 1941, and you can see my stepmother, my late stepmother, Errol, as a 3-year-old sitting on Drake's lap. But I never knew Waldo Drake. He died when I was 2 years old. But I heard the stories about him from Errol, and I decided to write my senior honors thesis in college when I was an undergraduate history major at the University of New Mexico. I wrote my honors thesis on Drake's life from the fragments of information that I could glean at the time. And then it was a chance conversation with Pat Carlin from Naval Institute Press in 2020 where I was able to dust off this old project and greatly expand it and improve it. I went to archives across the country and found all kinds of great information about Drake and his story. And the book was published in September. And so that's the origin. Yeah.
Well, first off, it is a wonderful, wonderful book. Having had the chance to go through it, it is certainly one of the books that I was most looking forward to ever since when you came in. This was November of a couple of years ago now. It shows you how long these processes take. This was a title that I was really excited about. Oftentimes we get a lot of the same stories told and retold, but this was something that was genuinely new for the first time, a new story. And it's fantastic. And I think you having that personal connection with your family, because you were able to pull, you had all this source material, correct?
I had some of it.
Some of it.
Yeah, I had some of it. I had some photos and some personal letters. But, ironically enough, for being a newsman, Drake really left very few traces of his thoughts about the war or his duties, his responsibilities, his take on it. I had to rely on actually the Naval Institute provided oral history and some other documents, but I had to track down a lot of material. I had some fragments here and there from the family, especially some of the photographs that you see in the book. Mm-hmm. Those were really helpful and I think helped tell the story. But actually, and I appreciate your comments about it being, something that you were looking forward to in a fresh take. And actually, I want to, if you'll indulge me, talk about a take on something that I think the audience will appreciate. So, as you may recall, back on March 3rd, we had the Oscars, right? Mm-hmm. And you might remember in 2019. There was a movie called Midway, which was another recounting, one of the many film recountings of that battle. Right?
Sure, let's call it that.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to argue that a principal reason that Americans know what they do about the Battle of Midway is due in part to Waldo Drake, and let me try to convince you of this.
Okay.
So. On one of the slides that I've included here, on the right-hand side is a March 8th, 1942 memorandum that Drake wrote to Nimitz's chief of staff. And in the memorandum, Drake says that John Ford, the famous Hollywood director, was in Pearl Harbor and doing some film work for the Navy, making short films. And as I think most of the audience knows, John Ford was a Naval Reserve officer and he was making films for the Navy around this time. Anyway, so Drake arranges to have a private screening for Admiral Nimitz of Ford's Academy Award-winning film, How Green Was My Valley.
Mm-hmm.
And so Drake invites, obviously, Admiral Nimitz himself and Drake's boss at the time, who was in Pearl Harbor. This was Commander Robert Barry. He was an official at the Office of Public Relations in Washington, D.C., but he was out in Pearl Harbor. So they meet in Nimitz's quarters. Drake goes down to the movie theater, gets the reel of How Green Was My Valley, and they have a private screening in Nimitz's quarters. And Drake later recounts in a letter that Ford gave a neat little talk and that he and Admiral Nimitz really hit it off. Okay, so this creates a nice relationship. Well, a few months later, Drake tells Ford, hey, I think you and your film crew need to head out to Midway Island. He doesn't tell him why. He can't. And Drake certainly doesn't know what's going to happen out there. But Drake has wind that something is being planned, right?
Mm-hmm.
And something's going on out at Midway. So I found this cablegram in the archives, and it is it's dated June 2nd, 1942, just a few days before the battle.
Mm-hmm.
And the cablegram is addressed to Drake, but it says only, boy, that's service, thanks. So it's a little mysterious what Ford is thanking Drake for, but I have my hunch. It's, that he got him out there. He got him out there quickly and safely, and they're all set up. Well, as we know, Ford captures epic footage of the Battle of Midway. He's, nearly killed himself, right? And he comes back to the United States. He edits the film together, and the Battle of Midway, Ford's documentary, wins the Academy Award for Best Documentary Film 1942. So when we're talking about public relations and the kinds of things that Drake was doing, these are the kinds of things we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'm always, so that particular bit of information is just absolutely amazing and fascinating. But I am just, as a person who does a lot of videos, I'm always amazed at the amount of video that footage that the Navy managed to capture during World War II. The guys standing on decks of ships that are being shot at, and with airplanes coming in. You have Enterprise and Solomon Islands, taking bomb hits as the camera guys are watching. And so I will say the Navy did a real good job at attempting to document these large engagements. And with that, obviously, that example with Ford is pretty incredible. But it just goes to show you that they were definitely thinking about it. Like they knew something, that they had something with this. Now, I'm going to go slightly out of order. I was going to ask this question later, but you've touched on two things so far. And since we're here, I wanted to ask this question. So first off, you said Drake never really wrote about his experiences. And then you've also obviously mentioned filmmaking. Would you like to tell the audience about James Bassett and his work, and how maybe there's a connection there to Waldo Drake?
Yeah, absolutely. So James Bassett, he is the sort of chorus in the background of the book, and I should have credited him from the outset. He really helps tell the story. But so in the book, he's mostly referred to as Lieutenant Commander James Bassett, U.S. Naval Reserve, and he was Drake's colleague at the Los Angeles Times before the war. Mm-hmm. He was, I guess, about 15 years Drake's junior. So he kind of looked up to him. Well, Drake works with him at the Times, and then later brings him out to Pearl Harbor to be his assistant public relations officer before the Pearl Harbor attack. Mm-hmm. And so Bassett, he's a very gifted journalist and writer, and he kept a diary during World War II, and he later wrote a book called Harm's Way, which was turned into the film, the 1965 movie, In Harm's Way. And I think, for the careful reader, you can kind of maybe get a sense that some of the characters there are based on Bassett's experience with Drake and other public relations officials and commanders during the war. But I discovered the letters dozens, scores, gosh, there may even be 100 of them, the letters that Bassett wrote during the war to his wife, Willie. And several of them mention Drake. And they actually mention him like through code words. So Bassett called Drake Father Neptune as a term of slightly teasing, but also endearment, I think. But let me give you just a taste of one of the contents of the letters. So this letter is mentioning that back on, this was September 19th, 1942, and in Pearl Harbor, Drake, Commander Layton, and some other SINCPAC officers were celebrating their promotions to commander all at the same time. And so Bassett was there, and he described in this letter to his wife, Willie, the wedding down party, as they called it, at a location called Bad Manor. And Bad Manor was the name that Drake had given to his house, his menage, as he called it. And it was the site of celebrations, little parties, and wingdings, as the officers called it. And so Bassett's reporting this scene to his wife, Willie. Let me read a little bit of this letter. And he's referring here to Francis Black. This was Drake's housemate, but he calls him Francis B in the letter to avoid any kind of censorship. So he says, Francis B did the empresaroing and did it up brown, even to helium-filled balloons that blustered around the overhead in black, yellow, white, and red, and which will go aloft tomorrow as radio mediographic balloons for stratosphere soundings. There was a great deal of talk, but little enough said. Also, much drinking and a bit of nibbling on the inevitable cold storage turkey and canned ham. A few Navy nurses looking antiseptic, and one or two wives of district officers who didn't look antiseptic. Then it was over, and a lad that I know and I went off somewhere glumly to a sweaty movie where we thrilled to Rita Hayworth in tights and Technicolor. So you can see why these guys were in public relations, right? They had a way with words, and Drake was equally skillful with discourse. And I just delighted in finding these letters and the descriptions of their life in Pearl Harbor and their work. And
it really is incredible.
It's so great. And I'm only able to include a handful of them. If I could have had 10,000 more words to fill the book with these kinds of quotes, I would have done so.
People have to read the book though. So, but
yeah, that's true.
but it is absolutely incredible. Now, obviously the as the title suggests, Nimitz is Newsman, but you brought up another point, and then Drake was assigned to Pearl Harbor and to this position prior to Nimitz, right? So he had worked under Admiral Kimmel, is that correct?
Right.
Okay. And then how long before Pearl Harbor was he assigned to Pearl Harbor? Or actually, before the attack on Pearl Harbor, how long had he been stationed there? He arrived in June of 1941. So he had been there for a few months. Oh, okay. I understand. So you're talking about this connection to Hollywood, and that takes me into my next question here for you. So the Navy did a pretty good job at promoting itself during the 1930s. For example, cooperating with Hollywood to make feature films that introduce audiences to naval aviation, etc. And that sort of gave the Navy sort of a glamour. And it was, for instance, what was the title of that movie? But it's some of the only original film of Battleship Arizona that we have actually sort of in service. Versus just standard black and white photos, in various yard periods. So Navy PR seemed to be on the right track, at least for the interwar, sort of pre-war period. Would you say that was correct? Or was it the anti-publicity sector of the Navy was that movement was that deeper rooted than you may have thought, and ultimately, as the war in the Pacific kicks off, do you think that sentiment changed, and so the attitude towards PR does almost like a 180, and so now we really don't want that spotlight? What do you think about that?
Yeah, this is a very complex question. And you're certainly right about the interwar period. Ryan Waddell in his book Selling Sea Power, Navy, let me get the title right. Selling Sea Power, Public Relations in the US Navy, 1917, 1941. This book it kind of inspired my own here on Drake, but this book does a masterful job of explaining the rise and success of Navy public relations in the interwar period. But the account stops just before the Navy's reorganization and Drake's appointment as Fleet PRO. And what I've come to see is that there were plenty of officials in the Navy who did have a positive attitude toward publicity, but the figures who eventually became the top commanders in the Navy and in the Pacific, they had a more complicated view. And let me try to explain this. So the Navy begins transforming public relations in 1940 with the establishment of the Office of Public Relations, or OPR. And this is under the Secretary of the Navy's purview, the secretary at the time being Frank Knox, who had been appointed by President Roosevelt. Knox is a Republican, but Roosevelt really respects him, especially his public relations skills. Now, prior to Knox's becoming Secretary of the Navy, public relations had been housed in the Office of Naval Intelligence. But Knox, being a pretty savvy PR guy himself, he pulls it out of ONI, puts it under his own purview, and gives the office much expanded resources and personnel, et cetera. So one of the major changes that occurs at this time is that the Pacific Fleet, for the first time, gets its own public relations officer, and that's Waldo Drake. So he heads out, as I said, to Pearl Harbor in June of 1941 and begins to do the work. So it's clear that the Navy recognized and accepted the need to expand public relations with wars looming in Europe and possibly the Pacific. And we can see Drake's appointment to the fleet as evidence to put personnel and structures in place. But the problem is that Admiral Husband Kimmel, who at the time was commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, he had a more complicated or ambivalent relationship with the press. And Drake struggled to expand and improve public relations under Kimmel's leadership. And I found lots of memos and letters mentioning the challenges that Drake faced out there. In one letter, Drake describes having drafted a comprehensive public relations plan for the fleet, but Admiral Kimmel and other members of his staff killed it. And they told Drake, you need to spend more time with the fleet before you propose such an extensive overhaul of public relations. And they basically kind of shunted him aside and kept him kind of down. And Drake, realized it was going to be tough, and he had to turn down a lot of requests from correspondents for interviews with Admiral Kimmel, who was reluctant to talk to them. But I did find this one example I'd love to share, which is I'm sharing here an image of the November 18th, 1941 cover of Look magazine. And at the time, Look was the second most popular magazine in the United States behind Life magazine. And you can see here that Drake landed Kimmel on the cover. And it's interesting, though, because Kimmel got cold feet about the article, the profile of himself that was supposed to accompany the cover. And so the cover ran without the accompanying article. But nevertheless, the photo is striking. You can see Kimmel here standing below the 14-inch guns of his flagship, the battleship Pennsylvania. And he looks very regal and confident as he scans the horizon, binoculars in hand. And, this cover, for me, makes it even all the more tragic what's going to happen just a few weeks later, right? But Drake had started working on this Look magazine piece back in July. And he had taken, Drake knew how to take a newsworthy photograph for sure. And he had arranged for this photo shoot. He had sent the negatives to Los Angeles to have them developed and released there. But Kimmel had gotten, as I said, cold feet about the whole situation. He asked for the negatives to be returned to Pearl Harbor. Drake had to get them back. And so you can see this was kind of illustrative of the broader ambivalence that top commanders like Kimmel and others had about working with the press. And these other top officers just happened to be Admiral Nimitz, Admiral King, and Admiral Halsey. So you have all these folks who are very ambivalent. And even though the staff officers around these folks, many of them tended to see the publicity in a positive light. These top commanders were very security conscious and created a tough situation, I think, for Drake and other public relations officers. So in July, for example, in July 1942, Drake's telling members of the SINCPAC staff that Admiral Nimitz will not take additional public relations personnel on the staff. And in one letter I found, Drake is commiserating with the head of the Office of Public Relations in Washington. This at the time was Captain Leland Lovett. And let me just read a section of this letter because I think it's very telling. He says, "We appreciate what you expect from us and likewise understand what the working press wants and requires. Please let me add, likewise, that Captain Wiltse, who was Nimitz's chief of staff for personnel, he says, Captain Wiltse, as our immediate supervisor, is sympathetic. There are other factors, however, which prevent the output that I know you hope for. We are most grateful for your forbearance in this respect and assure you that we are struggling constantly for an increase in the flow of news and pictures to the mainland." Now, I think that passage is very telling because the unnamed other factors here are, of course, the press avoidant Admiral Nimitz, Admiral King, and Admiral Halsey. But Drake's too smart and diplomatic to put those names in a letter to Captain Lovett, right? Anyway.
So, well, that's, do you know, again, what that piece that was going to run in Look magazine on Admiral Kimmel, what that entailed? Was it just like a bio or just, I'm just wondering why he ultimately would have it pulled like that. What was he so concerned about?
Well, it's hard to know for sure, but the letters that I get from Gene Herrick, who was the editor in charge of the piece, the letters between Herrick and Drake, it seemed to me that it was just going to be like a profile, a bio, talking about Kimmel's leadership of the Pacific Fleet and concerns about fighting a war against Japan and what the American strategy, would be, and like just kind of looking forward as it was anticipated that war in the Pacific might be coming. And I think that the cover very clearly illustrates that. Like, America was preparing for war in Asia. They didn't know that the Japanese would open the war by a direct assault on U.S. forces in Pearl Harbor, but people presumed that something was going to be happening. So it was a profile. My hunch, and I don't know for sure, I can't read his mind, but my hunch is that Admiral Kimmel might have felt like, well, maybe this is too much to disclose, too personal. And he did not, he lacked control over the details of the profile. And I don't even think that it was ever actually conducted. Instead, what Gene Herrick proposed and what ultimately happened is that one of Drake's former colleagues at the time, a journalist named Hallett Abend, wrote an article that was included in the magazine with that cover. And it was the title of which I believe was How the United States Will Fight Japan. So, I mean, you have it right there. It's coming from a journalist rather than out of Kimmel's mouth. Fair. Right. So I think that's fair enough and probably a wise choice on behalf of the commander in chief of the Pacific Fleet. So I understand it. But
because Kimmel had been pretty vocal about his position in Pearl Harbor. He particularly didn't care for it. He thought that he was being sort of put out there into the middle of the Pacific, like almost begging for that strike. And it seems so. I guess a piece written by a journalist about them being out there in the middle of the Pacific in the Hawaiian Islands at Pearl Harbor, maybe he just felt that just didn't represent his thoughts and feelings. And maybe the thoughts and feelings that the American public didn't want to hear, maybe because he felt that maybe they were underprepared or understaffed, undershipped, so to speak.
Jack, I mean, you've hit the nail right on the head. And what's so important that I learned from looking at the archives is that, Kimmel is also savvy in public relations to the extent that his public pronouncements about the readiness of the fleet, the preparedness, and the steps that they've taken that's one side of it. And certainly Waldo Drake was promoting that image. And we have evidence especially in the local Honolulu press of, this image of Uncle Sam's blue jackets are ready. But in the private letters and memoranda that Kimmel's writing to Navy officials and to others, he's disclosing that there's a lack of preparedness and that he's struggling with equipment and personnel and rotations. And it's, the image you get is it's almost a shambles out there in Pearl Harbor, and Kimmel's just trying to struggle through the best he can. And I will say, because I bet some readers of the book and some audience members are curious, Drake was sympathetic to Kimmel, and years later he said that Kimmel was basically, raked over the coals in the press unfairly, and Drake echoed that sentiment, even though he worked directly for him at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack.
I mean, I feel like ultimately Kimmel was doing what he was asked to do, but the attitude of the Navy changed seemingly overnight. Obviously, there's this lead up to war. You have the Two Ocean Navy Act the previous year in 1940 after France falls. New ships are obviously coming in the future, but it won't be 1941 and it won't be 42 and it won't be most of 1943 either. And so Kimmel's basically given this just impossible task of take all these old battleships, send them out to Pearl Harbor, sit them there as a deterrence. But I don't think that he had a lot of confidence in his situation or sort of decision making back in Washington. I have said on this on this channel with the podcast that Ryan Szymanski and I do, the Japanese, even though the Japanese almost did us a favor at Pearl Harbor. If the Japanese had forced an attack somewhere else, that had forced Kimmel and his battleships out of Pearl Harbor, that would have forced that decisive great battle that the Japanese doctrine, they had been training for 20 plus years. And Kimmel not only would have lost all of his battleships, it would have done it in a way that none of that material would probably have ended up back in Pearl Harbor. So while Pearl Harbor was this incredible loss of life and it was a surprise attack, but we think about how many of those Pearl Harbor battleships managed to actually come back and fight in that conflict. And the crew, with crew who survived that attack versus just all those guys potentially being lost in an open sort of battle line engagement with the Japanese fleet. And so it was just really interesting. Now, using that sort of as a jumping off point to the next question here, getting back to Drake, since this is not an Admiral Kimmel program. How did Drake create boundaries between operational security, the lack of which might benefit an enemy? And I talk about this today. It's like, stop telling our enemies on TV what we're thinking and what we're doing, and then obviously then there's a morale component. You have to, like you've already mentioned, the home front. So what gets through the censorship? So what might boost morale back home, or what might degrade it? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. If we had to pick one word to describe this dynamic, I think it would be uneven or imperfect. But I want to say it's not entirely Drake's fault. So I'm going to share here a January 9th, 1942 memorandum. It's just a few weeks after Pearl Harbor, and Drake drafted this, and it's the basis for his censorship decisions. And these guidelines were based in turn on Navy Department policy. And they state at the top, in general, correspondence copy will be passed if it is accurate in statement and implications, does not supply military information, aid or comfort to the enemy, does not injure the morale of our forces, the people at home, or our allies, does not embarrass the United States, its allies, or neutral countries. And so, using these guidelines, Drake closely scrutinized press copy for any references to military operations or morale. And he ran his red pencil over anything that he believed might possibly benefit the enemy or weaken the resolve of U.S. forces, allies, or Americans back home. So, for example, and I mentioned this one in the book, Drake stamped "Released by Sink Pacific Fleet for publication, W.W. Drake," on United States Pacific Press Release number 13. And I saw this with my own eyes in the files of one of Drake's sons, John Drake, who had a copy of this. And the release contained remarks of Captain Ellis Zacharias to his ship's company upon their return to patrol duty after visiting Pearl Harbor. And Drake ran his red pencil over references to the crew's low morale after seeing the destruction there. Mm-hmm. The pencil marks cover these lines. "I am really sorry that the ship had to go into Pearl Harbor the other day and observe what had taken place there, because I think it served to give you all an entirely wrong impression." And also these lines were covered by the red pencil. "Therefore, do not let the things you have seen depress you." So, wow, right? Like, it's clear that protecting morale deeply concerned Drake. I mean, he doesn't even want references to possible morale dampening remarks. But of course, some correspondents did not share the view that American morale was so fragile. And in other cases, Drake's censorship actions seem to be totally arbitrary. Let me give you an example of that. Mm-hmm. So, for example, in one instance, I found International News Service's Richard Tregaskis. He arrived in Honolulu in early 1942, and like many correspondents, his first stories dealt with the transport convoy coming over to Oahu from the mainland. So Tregaskis submitted one of his first stories to Drake, who blocked its publication because, contrary to Navy censorship guidelines, it contained the names of enlisted men. And Tregaskis scratched his head and asked Drake why the names of enlisted men couldn't be mentioned. Mm-hmm. And Drake replied, "Because there's a rule that said it couldn't be done." Okay. So this mystified Tregaskis because the names of officers could be included. Mm-hmm. So Tregaskis harps on this seemingly inconsistent and arbitrary guideline for weeks, but he didn't push Drake too far because, as he noted in one of his memoirs, the fleet's PRO seemed very vexed and extremely worried all the time. And so Tregaskis realized it was better to not antagonize Drake, or he might risk further censorship. But anyway, I'd also like to read you a section of a letter that Drake wrote in the aftermath of the Pearl Harbor attack, because, as I said, it wasn't entirely his fault, this situation. And this letter really speaks to that, and I think can give your audience a good sense of the dilemma that he faced. So on February 20th, 1942, he hands a confidential letter to Captain Willard Kitts. And Kitts had been on Kimmel's staff and was going to the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington, D.C. And Drake wanted Kitts to hand this letter to officials in the Office of Public Relations who he had been struggling to contact. So in the first paragraph of this letter, Drake implores Kitts. He asks him, "Will you please ask Admiral Hepburn, who is heading the Office of Public Relations at this time, and his assistant director, Commander Bob Berry, to give you an outline of what they expect from the commander-in-chief in the public relations field. Please emphasize that we have had no directives from the Office of Public Relations since the outbreak of hostilities, except several dispatches about specific situations." So it's clear Drake's unsure exactly what the fleet's public relations role should be under wartime conditions. He basically has a blackout on guidance coming from OPR in Washington. I mean, this is a February 20th letter. So for me, it's pretty outstanding that, wow, they really left Drake out there to improvise all on his own. And he did. He muddled through. But you can see how some of the decisions he made early on may have basically locked in place structures and processes that really hamstrung him and the Navy later in the war.
Now, so in your endorsements on the book, Matthew Seeger calls Drake's efforts pioneering, but then at the same time, Steve Rozecki calls his efforts misguided. So, given what you had just said, what side of that do you fall on?
I fall right in the middle, in the middle, because they were pioneering in the sense that they by necessity, he had to pioneer these practices because the Navy hadn't done this before under wartime conditions.
Yeah.
And so you see in a lot of the letters and memos, Drake is improvising, and then he's later asking OPR officials for permission to continue those policies and practices that he basically had to make up because something had to be done. I mean, he's got a dozen correspondents sitting in his office. He's got to figure out what to do. So he is pioneering some of the early practices. A couple others that I thought were notable is, as a matter of policy, he asks Admiral Nimitz and gets his endorsement for correspondents to go out with the fleet, to accompany the fleet on operations. I mean, embedding journalists, right? Like it's right here. And Drake is responsible for making that the Pacific Fleet's policy by default. And he does a number of other things as well that readers learn about in the book. So he is pioneering, but he's also, it's imperfect, it's challenging. And what was Rezecki's word? He said,
misguided.
Misguided. There are certainly instances of what I think readers would determine were misguided decisions that Drake took with certain correspondents or in the establishment of policy that created problems for himself. Absolutely. So I think it's both, and I would come down right in the middle. I know that's probably cheating, but there you go.
No, and I certainly agree. And ultimately, despite the examples that might point him down the misguided path, I agree with the fact that his efforts are pioneering. I mean, you have the largest sort of global war in human history. It's also at a time when, the Navy participates in World War I, obviously, but you talk about the PR and the media capabilities, just from technology, in World War I to then suddenly 2 decades later, you can put cameras on board every ship and record battles, photography, you have Hollywood producers and directors out on Midway Island. So for the very first time in history, not only do you have the largest conflict, but now you have the technology to capture it. And all of a sudden he has to deal with that. While it might seem misguided, I could certainly say, I think overall, though, his work is very pioneering, and ultimately then carries forth into today. And then the same can be said almost about the conflict in Ukraine, where for the first time you have a conflict of that sort of nature, but everyone has a cell phone,
right?
So everyone now, you're not censoring anything. Guys are walking around and you're seeing stuff happen in real time, live, and how are you supposed to do anything about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the media landscape that Drake faced, presumably will never encounter again. He had the opportunity, based on the media technologies at the time, to strictly control the flow of news and publicity that was reaching the United States. Those days are gone forever. So it is a different time. But I think some of the dilemmas that Drake faced are evergreen, perennial, and readers get a sense for those as well.
Oh, fair enough. Yeah. Okay. So changing course a little bit here. So on this channel, we have a vested interest in CV2, USS Lexington, which was damaged and scuttled at Coral Sea, and the reporting of Stanley Johnston, which is and NIP published a book by Elliot Carlson, who also wrote the foreword to your book. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then on the subject of operational security, can you recount the story and the issues involved for our audience?
Yeah, absolutely. And let me just say, Elliot Carlson is the reason I wrote my book, because without his books, Joe Rochefort's War and Stanley Johnston's Blunder, I would never have had the idea or frankly the confidence to go forth with this project. But Elliot shared with me some of the information that he had, and it convinced me that this project was viable, and I am forever in his debt. But let me recount that story a little bit and give you kind of the Drake's angle on it. But on June 7th, 1942, the Chicago Tribune publishes a front page story, the title of which is Navy had word of Jap plan to strike at sea. And that the story divulged the composition of the Japanese fleet assembled for the Battle of Midway. And it would have been clear to the careful reader that the U.S. Navy had cracked the Imperial Japanese Navy's secret code. So an aide showed the story to Admiral King, who later remarked that whoever in the Navy had leaked the secret information should be shot. And King was not joking, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
knowing King, yeah, I believe that.
Yeah. So King presumed that when enemy intelligence agents discovered the Tribune's story, that Japan would change its secret code and eliminate the Navy's hard-won advantage. So within days, King learned that Chicago Tribune reporter Stanley Johnston had drafted portions of the story while on board the USS Barnett, which was en route from the Pacific to the West Coast after Johnston's transfer from the carrier Lexington. And that carrier had been fatally damaged and scuttled during the Battle of the Coral Sea in May. Mm-hmm. So how Johnston gained access to the secret information and who had permitted its disclosure in the Tribune, that all became the focus of the FBI and the Navy Department in their investigations. So Drake and OPR officials, Office of Public Relations officials, they were soon involved. And on June 18th, I found a memo that Drake had provided to his boss at OPR that mirrored the statements that he had given to an FBI investigator in Pearl Harbor. So he explained that Johnston had been accredited to the fleet since March, and he asserted that proper procedures had been followed in verbally communicating censorship rules to Johnston. And he'd also furnished Johnston a copy of the memorandum of specifying prohibited content. And Drake explained that Admiral Nimitz had approved Johnston's assignment to the Lexington and everything seemed to be above board. But critically, Johnston had not signed the written pledge to uphold Navy censorship regulations. And that pledge was required of every correspondent in Pearl Harbor. Now, this oversight would be significant if Johnston was later charged with the crime.
Sure.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
Now Drake shifted blame for this oversight to officials in Washington at OPR. So he writes in the memo, quote, "It was assumed all Navy regulations had been complied with before Johnston was dispatched to the Pacific Fleet by authority of the Secretary of the Navy." So you could see him trying to get this off of me. So he never, but Drake nevertheless wrote later that we are, quote, "ensuring that all correspondents execute the Pacific Fleet Agreement as well as those you send with their credentials." So he is taking some responsibility there. But interestingly, in Elliot Carlson's book, he explains that during a telephone call with Commander Barry at OPR, Drake stated that he'd given no specific verbal instructions to Johnston. And so this was really a laxity at odds with Drake's, usual rule-bound behavior. And so, when the FBI is looking for information about this case, they see that Johnston looks pretty chummy with Drake. And there was one letter that Drake had from Johnston. It said, "What a pal you turned out to be. Wait till I get back to Honolulu. Hope to see you inside next 10, 12 days if luck holds." So again, Drake reports that Johnston, during his time in Pearl Harbor and aboard the Lexington, had complied with censorship regulations. And so basically attention shifted to the transfer to the Barnett, Tribune employees and officials in Washington. So the pressure's off Drake a little bit. But, the Secretary of the Navy, the president, they really want to hammer Johnston and the Tribune for this leak of secret information. And so they impanel a grand jury. But Admiral King is not going to risk further disclosure of the Navy's cryptographic secrets by a public trial and a grand jury. So the grand jury is eventually dissolved. So the whole situation really took a toll on Drake, and he'd come really unnervingly close to shouldering the blame here. And I found this letter for me is just, it's delightful. So after sort of, the whole situation starts to wind down, Johnston writes a thank you letter to Drake. It's dated September 30th, 1942. And this, I think, really tested Drake's diplomacy. And in his reply to Johnston, Drake writes, I'm glad to see that you came up smiling. And he added, everyone here thought you turned in an excellent series of articles on the last adventures of the Lex, except censorship was rather lax in several instances. I thought, yeah, nice way to put it. Yeah. So anyway, hope you find that one as amusing as I do.
Oh no, it's absolutely. So since we've talked about Midway and cracking the Japanese code and ultimately getting sort of the drop on them in that situation, I wanted to talk about. So we've taken on this channel, we've taken several stabs at the Army Air Corps in various videos, and I want to touch on this idea that the Army Air Corps' PR people talk about taking a lot of credit for Midway in terms of sinking Japanese carriers with B-17s, and Admiral Nimitz, and ultimately Admiral Nimitz sort of allowing them to do that as maybe a potential way of covering up the fact that Navy intelligence had cracked the Japanese codes. So, I mean, obviously, it's a ridiculous idea to think that a bunch of high-level B-17s sank a bunch of Japanese carriers. But do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, that decision really was on Admiral Nimitz, and Drake twisted himself into knots dealing with this situation. I'd like to show you one particular handwritten note that I think really tells a story here, and I'll try to read a portion of it, but you'll have to forgive me because reading Admiral Nimitz's handwriting is a little tough. This is a June 16th, 1942 note that Nimitz writes to Wiltse, the chief of staff, and to Drake. And in the first paragraph, numbered paragraph, he says, I'm changing the prepared address today. I have avoided giving the impression that the carrier groups present at Midway were present in Pearl Harbor today. Then he says, the above is important, and I will appreciate it if you ask the newsman to refrain from stating that the carrier groups were present at the ceremony. I wish to convey the impression carriers are at sea. Right? So Nimitz is, and then I think this is Nimitz handwriting at the bottom here too, where he says, Arnold's broadcast states we knew Japs were coming. And so I think Nimitz is kind of horrified that this is going to reveal their cryptographic secrets and how they were able to defeat the Japanese at Midway. So in addition to this misdirection from Admiral Nimitz, he actually forbids Drake to disclose details of the battle and orders him not to publicly contradict the Army's pretensions to maintain security. So hamstrung, Drake watches helplessly as erroneous reports of the Army Air Corps and its role in the battle, they pass right through his hands. A couple examples here of just related coverage, but you can see how Drake was floundering here. United Press's Robert Miller wrote in his diary on June 12th, quote, had my first run-in with Drake and won. Did a think piece on what would have happened had Midway fallen, and he was against passing it. However, it went to someone higher up and came out without emasculation. And then the next day, Miller submitted another story, but this time Drake sat on it. And Nimitz's new flag secretary at the time, Lieutenant Commander Preston Mercer, he had to step in and, according to Miller, quote, did wonders in getting it loose, much to Waldo's disgust. Right? So Drake's like, he's like, I can't keep a lid on this stuff. So Drake complains to Commander Barry, the deputy at OPR in Washington, and he writes this in one of the letters. He says, Admiral Nimitz insisted that all of the Army's releases on Midway should be censored by us, the fleet, for security, but for security only.
Okay.
And so the ramifications of holding back the truth were enormous. I mean, fights broke out between the services, correspondents were outraged at Drake, as you know. And according to Miller, this caused the near defeat of a congressional appropriations bill for the construction of aircraft carriers. So this was a big deal. So until Midway, it's ironic, right? Drake has been waiting anxiously for releasable news to satisfy hungry correspondents. And then when the Navy wins the most decisive battle of the war to that point, he can't tell the story because of Nimitz's reticence in publicizing it. So, and then I just want to share one more. So desperate to set the record straight, on July 9th, 1942, Drake writes to his former colleague at the Times, Warren Francis, who at this time is chief of the Washington bureau of the Los Angeles Times. And he writes to Francis, "I will be most grateful if you can tell me who is the motivating influence behind the persistent false propaganda that Army planes were chiefly responsible for the victory at Midway. I assure you, nothing could be farther from the truth." But again, Nimitz wouldn't disclose, the information that would support Drake's claim. So he apologizes to Francis. He says, "I can't show you the official report of the action to substantiate my statement." But then he writes this, and I think this is fairly noble of Drake. He writes, "Please let me emphasize that I'm not making this request officially, but as a sincere personal effort to see justice done to the people who deserve the credit, namely the Navy and Marine flyers who, many times risking almost certain death from enemy anti-aircraft and fighter opposition, took their torpedo planes and dive bombers close in to the Jap carriers and cruisers and destroyed them." So on July 12th, Drake sends a similar letter to the New York Times' Hanson Baldwin, who had also reported the Army's erroneous claims. And I think, Drake did the best he could to try to set the record straight. But at the time and in years subsequent, there had been this controversy that had lingered over this.
So it really is interesting because ultimately, like, the Army Air Corps would eventually go on to say, "Oh, like, we beat the Japanese in the Pacific because we dropped atomic bombs." It's like, well, how did your B-29s get there? All the Marine, taking all those islands and defeating the Japanese Navy, and your B-29s didn't do that. And so it really is interesting. And then, of course, in the post-war environment, then suddenly you have a change of leadership in Washington, who ultimately starts to the Navy comes under that sort of scrutiny. Now they really have to fight and justify themselves, for as you mentioned, just money to be able to build new ships. It's quite fascinating. At any rate, since we already talked about what is and is not potentially getting out, did Nimitz and Drake, did they disagree, agree, how more often than not? And do they often agree or disagree about maybe some of the topics, like, for instance, like correspondents wanting to write about, like, shark attacks on Navy flyers, or what was that dynamic like?
Yeah, that's a great question, and let me give you the story about the shark attack, because that serves as a highlight here. So after the Battle of Midway, Drake was able to arrange a press conference with Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo 8, the squadron that had come from the Hornet, one of the participating carriers at the battle. And Ensign Gay described feeling dorsal fins of sharks swimming under the life raft that he spent the night in after his plane had been shot down. So Gay said that blood in the water from the many casualties attracted the sharks. So as usual, the reporter on this story, this was Frank Tremaine, United Press's Frank Tremaine, he submits the story to Drake for censorship. And Drake immediately runs his pencil over the mention of the sharks. And Tremaine looks at it and just like starts shouting at him at the SINCPAC public relations office. And he says, "You can't take that out. There's no security involved in that." And Drake shoots back, "I'm not going to let the mothers of America read that."
Yes.
And so back and forth they go, each getting more frustrated. And so finally, a red-faced Drake hollers at him and says, "If you don't like it, take it up with the Admiral." And Tremaine says, "All right, I will." And Tremaine had a pretty good relationship with Admiral Nimitz. So Tremaine grabs the copy and he heads to Nimitz's office, which was on the same floor. And he charges through the saloon type doors that were in the outer hall. And, Nimitz's flag secretary is sitting inside and he's like, hey, where are you going? And before Tremaine could reply, out comes Nimitz from his office, accompanied by two other admirals and a Marine colonel. And he sees Tremaine standing there before him and he says, why, Frank, what's the matter? And Tremaine says, Commander Drake said to see you about this. And so Nimitz puts his arm around him and says, okay, why don't you come into my office and we'll talk about it. So they get inside and Tremaine shows Nimitz the story. He hands it to him. Nimitz looks it over and he says, well, I don't see anything wrong with this story. And then Tremaine says, yeah, well, Drake said he was not going to let the mothers of America read about blood and sharks in the water. And so, I'm sure Drake's sitting in his office, like wondering, okay, what's going to happen here? So Nimitz summons him to the office with Tremaine still in it. And he says to Drake, there is nothing wrong with this story. The mothers of America are not your concern. And so he kind of slaps Drake down right in front of the correspondent, which was extremely rare. Most of the time that they agreed. Now, I want to defend Drake here because from one point of view, Nimitz is absolutely correct. You can read the Appendix B of the April 12th, 1942 regulations for correspondence as covering only the prohibited content around security. But as I mentioned to you before, there's this piece in the preface about morale. And so Drake knows that the only thing that flyers in the Pacific feared more than being devoured by sharks after being downed was captured by the Japanese. He knows this, and he does not want that information disclosed in the press. And so, so I looked in all of the online newspapers that I could find in the archives and such for Tremaine's article, and I found plenty of references to Ensign Gay's story, but I never found any references to the shark.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if, at that moment, like Nimitz, was defending Tremaine, but that Drake kind of came back later and said, well, Admiral, we really can't let him write this because, this is going to be tough on U.S. forces, et cetera. So it's possible that reference to the sharks does appear in some story that I couldn't find, but in the ones that I could find, I couldn't find it. So I thought, well, Drake actually won this one, even though Tremaine thought he had, won the day with Admiral Nimitz.
Right. Won the battle, lost the war.
Yeah, exactly.
And then obviously shark attacks in World War II, you have to then talk about the sinking of the Indianapolis, and obviously made famous by Jaws, which I believe that's its 50th anniversary this year, if I'm not mistaken. The movie, not the sinking of the Indianapolis.
Yeah.
And there was a substantial amount of, obviously, that story gets covered up because of, there's a few Navy blunders in there, the mission being secret with the atomic bomb. So there's just, and then, of course, the idea that, where'd most of your crew go? Unfortunately. Right. And then the fact that, they're not found after, or it takes them so long to get found and then ultimately rescued. So that's kind of what we're talking about here is that, there's some security stuff, but then it's just a morale problem. It really is fascinating. Since we're talking about movies too, and maybe you have an opinion, but the original Top Gun from the 80s, huge morale boost in terms of like Navy PR, and you see, in that boost in period. Did you see the second one?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Well, so my take is it goes, the idea is, especially with Navy cooperation in movies, we're supposed to be able to come back and say, this makes me want to join the Navy. This gets people excited and such like that. And ultimately, like, they win at the end of this, in the second movie, win for whatever that's worth. But the plot of the movie, it's like, join the Navy and here's an old F-18. You're going to get shot down, but it'll be okay because Tom Cruise is there. From a PR public relations standpoint, the second movie doesn't have the same feel that the first one did.
I have to agree with you on that. It makes me wonder how old Waldo Drake would have perceived too. I think he would have agreed with you that the first movie was absolutely PR perfection for the Navy, and the second one maybe not so much. But
not so much. Yeah.
I try to avoid commentating on current affairs.
Sure. No, I get it completely. But that was just a take that I had come up recently, and I was like, oh yeah, I can totally agree with that. So we've been talking about Drake and Nimitz's relationship. Did Drake help Nimitz and his get appointed to CNO?
So, okay, this is a tough one in the sense that I've only have one bit of evidence here, and it comes directly from E.B. Potter's biography of Nimitz. So, 100% credit to E.B. Potter for this anecdote, but let me share it. So, Japan signs the instruments to surrender on September 2nd, and Drake at this time is working for the Office of War Information in Washington, D.C. He's returning to the Times, but he has this kind of dual role with OWI and the Times, and he's appointed to serve as the press relations officer for the Allied Reparations Committee and in its group that's heading out to Japan. And this was headed by Edwin Pulley, who was President Truman's representative on the committee. So according to Drake, the committee was involved in, quote, ferreting out Japanese assets that can be used to foot the reparations bill. So the 14 members of the committee are going to depart Washington, and they're going to go to Japan, China, the Philippines, etc. Okay, so Nimitz gets wind that Drake is coming to Pearl Harbor on the forward, in advance of the committee's onward flight to Japan. And it had been more than a year since Drake had been in Pearl Harbor, and Nimitz is back from Guam. He's at the cement pot Makalapa Hill in Pearl Harbor, and he invites Drake out to meet. And, their old rapport returns. I don't know if they played tennis at the time. I imagine they might have, because they had played tennis together nearly every day.
Might as well.
Nimitz knows that Drake's pretty well connected at OWI in Washington. He's an insider there, and he says, he had let Forrestal know that he was interested in the CNO position, which was the top uniform position in the Navy, but consistent with Secretary Forrestal's attitude, basically since he had been Navy Secretary for the last part of the war. He reports to Drake, he says, I haven't got much enthusiasm out of the secretary. And so he asked Drake, I'd like to know if you have any ideas that might help. And Drake says, just by chance, I do, Admiral. And he says, my friend Ed Polly is arriving on an airplane that is taking us to Japan tomorrow. And he's the man who put Harry Truman in the White House. He succeeded in having him nominated at the Chicago Convention, and he later became vice president. So he's the only man, I think, who could help you. So Nimitz probably grinned in the way that he did when Drake gave him good news. And he says, well, bring him out. And so the next day, Drake introduces Admiral Nimitz to Polly, and the two men talk privately about Nimitz becoming CNO. Polly likes Nimitz immediately, and in Nimitz's presence, calls President Truman on the phone and basically advocates for him. So it's of course, it's unsure exactly how much influence this telephone call has, but according to E.B. Potter, he writes, it could not have hurt his chances. And certainly I think, and Potter acknowledges, it may have paved the way for Nimitz's meeting with President Truman just a couple weeks later in Washington, D.C. And after that meeting, President Truman names Admiral Nimitz CNO. So that's how Drake might have played a role there.
So maybe ultimately, Drake does some helps out Nimitz, and so what? Just in wrapping up, real quick, what, just for the audience's sake, post World War II, do you just give a quick just rundown of Drake?
Yeah, for sure. So again, he works for OWI for a time in this kind of bridge capacity, but then he becomes the Asiatic correspondent for the Times, and first, serving in Japan, and then I think he visits the Philippines, but then ultimately ends up becoming the Asiatic correspondent based out of Shanghai. the Broadway mansions in Shanghai, and stays there for a number of years. And again, my stepmother, Errol, has memories of being in the Broadway mansions in Shanghai as a little girl. And so Drake's covering the rise of the communists. Right after World War II, Drake becomes the first Westerner into parts of China and Mongolia since the war had begun. And so he's covering a lot of those stories. But he covers the rise of the communists. And when it's clear that the communists are going to come to power, he leaves. He departs China. I think this was in 1946, I believe, and goes to become the European bureau chief for the Times, and then is covering the Cold War in Europe and in Eastern Europe. But also Drake's traveling the world at this time, going to Africa, the Middle East. Courtesy of one of Drake's grandchildren, I've seen copies of Drake's 3 passports, and every page is black with ink from all the places that he had been covering the mid 20th century on behalf of the Times. So he retires from the Times, I think it's in 1962, and retires to Three Arch Bay in Southern California, and enjoys a kind of resort lifestyle, plays tennis every day, swims in the ocean every day, just like his old boss, Admiral Nimitz, did. That was, there was a lot of adventures along the way. Drake breaks his leg jumping out of an airplane at one point. He has to escape Eastern Europe with his wife, and they nearly get in trouble. There's all kinds of adventures, but those are saved maybe for another day.
So maybe there's a movie option here somewhere.
If you're listening, Tom Hanks and your production company, I'm ready for the call.
Yeah, we know Tom Hanks. He came to Naval Institute for Greyhound, so maybe we can send him another typewriter, and he'll read our letter. I know you just gave a bunch of follow-up information. Is there anything else before we wrap up about Drake, or maybe even public Navy PR, which has now become public affairs? Is there anything that you'd like to add before we wrap up, Hamilton?
Well, I really want to thank you for the chance to talk to you about Drake's story today. I think in wrapping up, I would just want to mention the temporary citation that Admiral Nimitz included in his letter to Drake after Drake was reassigned to the Office of War Information in 1944. And it stated that Drake's performance of duty was in keeping with the highest traditions of the naval service. And as we talked about before, I think that Drake's service was imperfect, but he did navigate the treacherous waters and communication currents at the time in a way that I truly believe sincerely did help America's war effort against Japan. And it's clear, I think, for readers of the book, that Drake was very loyal to Admiral Nimitz, and he was loyal to those he admired and respected. And based on Drake's childhood, a traumatic childhood, his upbringing, his experiences in Southern California as a young man, I think he really yearned for loyalty in return. And from December 1941 through October 1944, he got it from Admiral Nimitz in abundance. Time and again, Admiral Nimitz defended and protected his newsmen. And so this devotion, I think that Admiral Nimitz showed to Drake, gave Drake reservoirs of emotional energy to proudly and effectively serve his country, his Navy, and his admiral. And for me, all of that really helps explain why it makes perfect sense that Drake's wife, Mary, she requested that Drake's ashes be spread at sea with only his Navy family in attendance. And for me, that is it's the perfect fitting end to Waldo Drake and to Nimitz's newsmen. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Hamilton. As I had said at the beginning of this interview, the story was so fascinating, and to get a topic that comes through sort of the office and as a book project that like this is really rare. Obviously, we publish a lot of books every year, but to get something like this genuinely new and that provides new insight is fantastic. So I encourage everyone, if you've liked the story that you've heard today, I know I I did, and I know I'm usually one of the first people to get a copy as when a new book comes out. So, but I encourage everyone to get a copy of Nimitz's Newsman, which is available right now wherever books are sold. I'll put a link; you'll see it come up here, and then it's also down in the description. We certainly appreciate Naval Institute Press for having Hamilton Bean on, and we look forward to the next one. And again, thank you so much, Hamilton. This was great. I know it's a little longer than we had anticipated, but I think that the information is really wonderful. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy day and speaking with me.
Thanks, Jack. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, and thanks everyone. We'll see you again on the next one.